Alrighty, having a look at the cloaking scene here. What I want to do is just break down the scene and just have a look and see how we can efficiently first create this wireframe setup, how we're going to do this transition that flows nicely through the body, and how we deal with that in quite an efficient way. So jumping into the scene, I've got this pre-set up scene here. If I go file open, it's shot 2 cloaking effects, B01, and I've tagged it with a start file. And I'm just applying this just to make life a little bit easier. So it's got our camera that's been scaled down. So this was originally an alembic camera that we've baked the frames out. So you can see the frames are baked. And this just helps us with motion blur at the end of the day. Otherwise, we'd get incorrect motion blur if it's not baked and it's been scaled down. The motion blur looks a bit odd. And then I've got the robot set up here, and inside here, diving in here, I've got 2 streams of data and just going through this first one. So the first one here is my alembic animation. And what I've done is just scaled it down to the size that we want to work at. This is actually the incorrect size still. It should be a bit smaller, but for now, this is fine, 0.1. This is how I actually worked on this setup. And then over here, what I've done is I've created this name attribute, and it's set to name from groups. So you can see if I middle mouse up here, I've got all these groups. And what I actually wanted to do was generate a name attribute for possible use later on. So if I go to my primitives here, you can see here I've got a name, and this corresponds with the actual group names now as well. So that's just another setting there. And then obviously we've got this alembic coming in as a packed alembics. So if I middle mouse, you can see there's a pack primitives 88, and it actually says alembic references 88. So what I needed to do just to gain a bit more access to the data is to unpack it. So you can see now we've got all our primitives. It's still a what we call a polysloop. So this is still represented as single primitives, but it's actually, exposing most of the geometry to us. Now, as soon as I do that, you can see in the viewport, there is some errors here. And what's actually happened is the setup that we received from Maya has a bunch of inverted geometry here. And you can see that, it's quite clearly shown in Houdini here with the setup here with this tint back faces on. So what I had to do with this is just, manually was the easiest way just to fix it, was manually just group this. And this is why, I'm supplying this scene just to avoid having to do this yourself. Just selecting that inverted geometry and then creating a reverse group of that and reversing the geometry. So we can see we've got the correct geometry coming in now. And that is my animated mesh. Now over on this stream, I've done the exact same thing. Oops, sorry. And what's actually happening is what I wanted to do is I needed a rest pose. So basically the robot as best as I could standing up, preferably in a T pose. And we unfortunately didn't receive that from the animation. So what I did is I went through all the shots and I found a shot where the robot is kind of standing up, and that was actually in shot 20. And if I view this now, and this is off kind of in its own space somewhere, and just going back to the time shift here, I've time shifted it to a frame that looked good, and this was exactly the frame. So you can see he's kind of standing, in a decent pose. It's not quite a T pose, but he's, it will do what we need to do. And this is just to be able to manipulate the data nicely instead of, having him in this zone here where he's kind of crouching over or lying down. We want this more kind of rest pose looking setup. And then I've gone ahead and just done the same thing, unpacked it and done the reverse. So this geometry and this one is identical. Your point counts and everything's exactly the same, which is what we need. And now what I can do is I can actually start creating data on this setup. And then what we want to do is transfer the animation from this guy onto this setup. And let's get started with that, and we can see how we can create, these transitions from this and then transfer that data. So the first thing what I want to do is just coming back to the animation here is I wanted to, create those nice extra details on the mesh for the outline and create a little bit more sci-fi patch looking setup rather than just the straightforward wireframe. And for that, I was looking at, or I had a look at the lots subdivision, and just coming in and having a look at this, where you can see immediately when I click it on, not much is changing. And that's because if I press information on here, we've still got those, we've unpacked it, but we've still got those 88 primitives, and this is because they're polysoups. And we can easily convert this into, mesh. This is still almost like a packed kind of setup. And to convert it, we can actually just use a convert sop. And I can just plug this in here, and you can see immediately the mesh change now. And if I middle mouse here, we can see we've now got all our primitives, access to all those primitives. We could in fact actually have, instead of using the unpack, if you go here, we've got our 88 primitives. And if I, bypass the setup, just for instance, we can see we've immediately unpacked it, gone from packed to unpacked. So you don't have to actually use the unpack. This is just probably a slightly quicker way of doing it. But just for clarity, I'm just going to leave the convert here. So, we've got the two processes that we know what we're doing. And then I've got my lab subdivision here. Now, the problem with doing this, and, I quite like the look, maybe we can, reduce the lot size down a bit, clean it up a bit, bring this down to 0.7. So we've got some nice edges here. And the problem with having it on animated mesh, and it's quite hard to see here, but it's changing on each frame. And to visualize that, we can just drop a color node, and I'm going to set this to primitives, and we're going to set this to random primitives. Now, if you take note of the arm area, and if I go one frame forward, you can see the colors are changing a little bit. Not too bad on this specific one, but they definitely are changing out. So you can see, it changes up there. So to avoid, that change in primitive count, because it's basically cooking every time this geometry gets deformed, we want to do this operation on a static mesh. And so if we bring this over to this side, we'll have this on a constant mesh. And let's just copy our convert here as well. So we've got the exact same setup. So now we've got this setup, and this is a single frame, and we can do other sorts of things to it. And then we need to transfer this data that we've created. We need to transfer the animation onto this. Now, the only other problem, obviously, is because we've now changed the point count and the primitive count. These meshes can't just be, you can't just copy the attribute, the position attribute or animation over very easily. And to do that, what we're going to actually look at is going a bit further upstream and having a look at, we created this name attribute, and we're going to use basically our packed primitives. So we've got, going back here, we've got our our 88 primitives, and each one's got a name, and these are all representing the parts of the robot. And we can actually use that those names on a node called a extract transform. and that will give us a point on each of these with some transform data, and we can copy that downstream onto this setup using a bunch of operations. So just to start off, we're going to do a extract transform this node, and we're going to plug our static mesh in here. So let's for starters, we're just going to plug it in here just to make it simple, and then our animated mesh into the second one. And we've got this set up. Now you can see if I go here, hopefully you can see that there's a 1 point. Let's just put in the point numbers so we can see there's a 0 point here. And that's not entirely useful, even though it is moving. If I ghost this, you can see it's kind of in the center of the object. Now what I can do on the extract transform is I can use this attribute piece, and that's a piece by name. And because we've basically named each, we've created that, it's almost like this path, we've created this name attribute of each component, and having a look at, maybe let's just have a look at one of the components on its own. So if I go into my select mode and I go select by alembic paths or by name attribute, you can see there when I hover over, it's highlighting an arm, forearm there. So these are each, that's one of the named attributes, and that's forming part of this 88 primitives here. And hopefully that kind of makes sense, that we basically extracting the the data, the name. We're creating a name out of each of those pieces, and then the extract transform will actually look at those pieces, and you can see now as soon as I toggle that on, now I get a point for each piece. And in fact, if you look at it now on middle mouse here, you can see I've got 88 points, which lines up with our 88 primitives. And if I scrub backwards and forwards, you can see those points are basically transforming in the same space as the robot. And you can actually have a look at the points here, the point attribute, and you can see it's actually generated a orient attribute for us, and this is storing the orientation of each point, basically how the packed primitive would be orientating based on each frame. So that's really useful. Now to basically copy it back so we get the animation back, so let's take a look. We've got the static frame. We can do a transform pieces node, and this is one of these nodes that we use quite often in the the rigid body dynamics setups. So we can use the first one's our geometry to transform, so we can take our static geometry, and the next one is our template points, which will be these points, and I can plug this in here and connect this up, and you can see now, well, this is just basically bringing the robot back to animation, which obviously looks the same. So if I click on this one and click on this one, visually you're not really seeing much difference, but that's because this geometry is exactly the same. So what we want to do is now take our modified geometry and we want to transform it like this. So I can say, okay, well, we've got these lot subdivisions here, and I've randomized the color, and let's plug this in and view this. Oh, now you can see, well, there's a little bit of a problem. It's not working anymore. So why is it not working? Well, if you have a look at the transform pieces, and like we said, we're using this name attribute. So if I have a look at the transform here, you can see we've got our name attribute. And if I go up here, I've got my name attribute. And if I go to the lots subdivision, you can see I've got a name attribute here as well, but it's kind of actually broken, because what's happening is the lot subdivision is changing the primitive count, and the name attribute is breaking. So you can see, let's just type name here. And if I scroll up and down, you can see all the primitives have names. If I go here, you can see there's some blank spaces. And so a lot of the primitives don't have the name attribute anymore. So we can fix this quite simply by copying this name attribute. Let's just view this robot as it is. We can copy the name attribute to each piece, but we can't just do a copy directly like this. We want to grab each component and then transfer the data just to make sure we have accuracy on each piece. So to do that, what I'm going to do is actually do a for each connected, or we can do connected piece or named primitive. Named primitive should be fine because we want to use the name. And what I can do now is I can plug this in, and this is going to give me, access to, if I do a single piece, each primitive like this. You'll see there's 88 primitives in the loop. And now I can do a lab subdivision on each primitive like this. So as I cycle through all the primitives, it will give me the same result really. It's just doing it on each individual one. But now, because I have this single object, what I can actually do is I can do an attribute copy node, and I can plug this in over here, and I can switch to my, well, let's just plug this second input here, and I can use my name attribute here. So I can transfer, you'll see it gives me a little bit of a warning, and that's just because the primitive count has changed, but it actually works just fine like this. So now I'm essentially copying the name of that primitive to the actual newly generated mesh. So now if I cycle through everything, it's given me now a name attribute. If I scroll through this setup, you can see there's no blank spaces anymore. And now let's plug this into the color, and let's view our transform pieces again. And now you can see it's actually working. And if you look closely, I've got my labs subdivision set up working fine, and it's actually transforming correctly to the original animated mesh. If I ghost it there, it's sitting perfectly on there. So that's really cool. You can imagine now we can do a whole bunch of stuff to this mesh, and we can actually, keep it static, do a bunch of stuff, and then just quickly transform it. You can see it's not really giving us much performance issues doing that. Obviously, when the mesh gets really complex, you're going to slow down, but it's fairly snappy as it is just doing this. So that's quite cool. Our colors aren't changing, so everything is consistent. And now we can move on to doing a couple of more things. So we need to deal with this transformation between the solid mesh and this mesh. And to do that, what we want to do is create a transition mesh like animation. And I want to do this in a solver so that it flows through the body. So having a look at the static mesh of the body, let's just go up here to this guy that we created. That's our kind of rest pose. And I want this to flow over the body and around, the arms and stuff. So it's not just a linear mask. And to do that, what we're going to do is actually create a solver, and we're going to initiate the solver and let the solver play out quite quickly through this and create that transition so it's a little bit more organic. So I'm just going to move this over a little bit, and let's move this down, and we can start creating that little solver setup and how we're going to do that on the side over here. Just diving back into the solver, and I just leave this at 1.5. It is quite high, but what I'm going to do is come down to this attribute blur here, and what I want to do is increase the blurring iterations a little bit. Let's just make it 10, and this will blur out the iterations quite a lot. So I'm getting a display problem again, and I think this is something to do with the caching up here. So what we can do is maybe turn off the cache simulation, and that should, allow us to work a little bit better. So I'm going to go back here and repin this. And for now, we can just, so I'm definitely having some display issues here. This usually doesn't happen. You can see I've got a warning here, and we've got some cook errors. So it's just not resetting properly for some reason. So unfortunately, we're just going to have to jump backwards and forwards. So you can see just by, using these blurring iterations and bumping them up, the transition's starting to happen a little bit quicker. The other thing what we can do is we can change this proximity radius, and this is just, basically where it's searching the blur, and it's going to blur in a different, slightly bigger radius. So doing something like that is going to increase the blur quite a bit. So I'm going to reset this and have a look now. You can see it's actually blurring out a fair amount quicker. And the other thing what we can do to speed it up even more is we can increase the sub-steps of the solver. If I take this down up to 3, you can see now immediately we're getting a much faster transition, and that's kind of blurring and traveling through the setup quite nicely. And what's nice about it is you've got this kind of organic feel that it's transferring across everything. It's not just a linear mask traveling up and through the body. It's actually traveling around the body. So when the animation's being applied, you get this nice organic feel traveling through the body. So the last thing what we want to do is just limit the active amount here. And to do that, we can actually just stay at this level. We can do another wrangle. And in this wrangle, I can just clamp that activate. So I can do a F at activate. That is spelled correctly. And we can say equals, and we can do a clamp. And we can say, get our attributes and say activate. And we can clamp that between 0 and 1, like so. And now if I look at this, we should have spelt it correctly. That should be clamping between 0 and 1. Yeah, you can see as we go up there, the maximum value. I've still got a 5 here for some reason. That's quite interesting that it's doing that and not actually clamping properly. But when we get up here, it seems to be, I'll just double check the settings here quick. Okay, just having a look at my original scene, it seems like that is actually happening. It just goes above a value and then goes back to 1 at the end. So we'll just leave it at that for now. And yeah, it will still work for us. So I just wanted a limit from going up to those 500-600 values and more. So that's looking fairly decent. Now what I want to do is just add another foot here, and we can add another grid. So do this, and we can move the grid over to this side like this. And if we had to merge this together like so, you can see now, well, now it's activating at the same time, which is obviously not ideal. We want to only activate the left foot at 179, which is over here. So what I'm simply going to do, just to keep it simple, is I'm going to do a switch node. I'm going to plug this in here, and I want to create a null, which is going to give me 0 data. Let's just move this around. And then I'm going to do a simple expression on here. So I'm going to go if $frame is greater than 179, or probably 178, then it switches to 1. So that's, you can see it's currently the solid line is now the switch is on 0. And as soon as I go there, now it's hitting frame 1, and now we're getting that activate on that next frame. So we're getting a transition happening like that. So that's pretty cool. It's working quite well. The next thing what I want to do is just do the hands, and we can, you know, activate that a bit further on, just checking the end frame here, 194. So it's kind of getting there. You know, it could probably be a little bit quicker, but maybe with the hands coming in at a slightly later frame, we will close in that gap and be finished the transition by then. So let's just create that. I'll go ahead and give myself a little bit more room here again. Just getting a bit crowded, yeah. Okay, so that is the, you can label this obviously if you want to, but I'm not going to do that. And then we want to do, I'm just going to copy this whole setup because I want to activate it after a certain frame. I'm going to do another merge, plug this in here, and then we want to do our hands. So I'm going to move this grid up to the hand here, and we can just use the exact same setup to transfer the data onto the hand. And we want to do this, you know, at a later frame. So let's just double check this animation again. Look through the camera. So as the character comes down, maybe, yeah, I think that's not too bad. His kind of hand starts, you know, almost just going through frame here might be a good indication just to start that transition. So can do 184. So, and let's just switch this to 183 because it's going to switch on the next frame. Let's just view this output again. And we can scrub through here, and there we've got our transition happening there. And we're getting there. We just want to maybe do the other hand as well. That can transition at the same time. So what I can do is just do another grid over here and merge these two together. So this is one switch, and we're going to move this grid over to his other hand, like so. And let's move it away from his body a bit. And now we can quite easily see that transition happening, and it's happening really quick as well. We don't have to wait for, you know, this animated cache to cache and try and deform it and all sorts of things. So that's working fairly well. We might be lagging a little bit, so we wanted to end the setup at, you know, 194, so we can then just maybe increase the substeps a little bit. And we've got pretty much spot on hitting that transition in the right timing now. And that's working quite well. So the next thing what we want to do then is obviously transfer this data to our mesh, and so we can start creating the masks and stuff that travel and switch between the, you know, the the actual rendered geometry and then the Sci-Fi panel look. That's going to be the outlines and stuff. So we're going to do that transfer. So what we can do is obviously just do a attribute transfer. We can transfer the activate, turn this off. And as soon as I do that, you can see now we're transferring the setup onto this If you want it to be a little bit more solid, you could potentially just, you could transfer or create this into a primitive attribute. So we could do a attribute promote. Could probably even just do it down here. Can do point to primitive. And if I view that, it's going to give me quite a nice look on the transition. You can see here I've got this kind of smooth blended values. If I do it like this, you can see it's more blocky, and that might just help us with the actual look. Just going to reduce this value down, to make it look a little bit more sci-fi and that digital glitch look. And you can see it's this transition is happening really fast. I'm going above real time here. So nice that we're just working on a static mesh and setting this up. Okay, so the next thing what we want to do is look at how we can deform parts of this mesh. So in the cloaking setup, we had what I did was create this each individual panel basically scaled up from nothing, and they were pushed outwards into space a bit, and then they kind of scaled back into place, and forming this slightly more kind of erratic look with a bit of a digital glitch vibe. And we can look at doing that. So we need to now be able to take this activate attribute, and we need to scale each individual primitive based off their current location. So we need to get the centroid of each primitive to scale them inwards, so they don't scale towards the center of the object. They need to scale each on the individual axis, and we need to have a setup that can do that, and then obviously be able to push them outwards a little bit, so they're almost coming out of nowhere, or from the sides up, scattered around a bit, and then pushing in and then scaling up at the same time. So we're going to look at doing that next. Okay, so just coming back to the animation here, just view that. What I want to do is obviously we want to create these transitions. Let's have a look at the camera. So we want to initiate the transition through the body at certain points. And what I was looking at when I set this shot up is to actually do it, this like foot impact, and there's another foot impact, and to kind of get the transition to almost flow naturally through the body as it hits, and then just to speed it along when we get to kind of this point, we initiate the arms as well, so we get this transition coming up through the body and then ending in the head area. So to do that, we want to actually, because we're working on the static mesh, what I want to do is just create some notes of where those impact points are. So creating a little sticky here, and I just want to go here and I want to create my impact. So I've got my right foot, we're looking at him this way, so his right foot is kind of hitting down at 174. So I'm going to just make a note, right foot 174, and then your left foot is 176, 7. 9's probably better, and so we go left foot 179. Oh, yeah, 179. Dyslexia coming in there, and then we can do the arms kind of around here somewhere. We'll do that on the fly just to time it a little bit better. But the next thing I just want to look at is where the shot ends, and I've got the shot ending around about here where the robot starts looking up. So essentially I want my transition to pretty much end around here somewhere, so maybe at 194. So we can go fx end, 194, and this just gives us some timings to work with. Like I say, we're working on a static mesh essentially down here, and we don't want to skip to the animation every time. We want to check how the transition's working. We want to just work on it and get the timing right on the static mesh. So to do that transition, obviously, like I said, we want to start on one foot and the other. So the first thing what I want to do is just create a initiating point on that foot. So I'm just going to create a grid, zoom out here and just place that grid roughly where the foot is. And yeah, that will be his right foot. And just make this grid quite small, so it's by his foot here, something like that. And then obviously to transfer this data, we're going to do a attribute transfer. We need some attributes to transfer the data onto. But to also efficiently work on this mesh, it's quite a lot of, some of the mesh has got quite a lot of detail, some's got quite a little. So just to create a smoother kind of mesh we want to deal with, I'm going to do a scatter points on this mesh, like so. Just bump the intensity up quite a lot. So we've got, something like that, maybe even more. That shouldn't be too bad. I've got some weird display issue happening here. That's a little bit odd. What we can try and do here is go to our labs up here, and we can do a reset viewport. And let's see if this helps us. Zoom in on it, zoom around a bit. It's looking a little bit better. Not too sure why it does that every now and then. But anyway, we've got now this static mesh with this, scattered points around. And what we want to do is obviously create some attributes, and then we want to transfer the attributes. And if you've used the SOP solver before, you're going to know what we're going to be doing. And that is creating a sort of an animation using the SOP solver. So just to do the initial setup so we can see what we're doing, we need our attributes. So I'm going to do a attribute create. And let's plug this first one in here onto a scatter. And I want to call this activate, like so. And we've actually got a little visualizer on it already. You can see it change color. And then on my grid, I'm just going to copy and paste this one. I want to set this activate value to 1. So this is our active. And then we're going to use eventually a attribute transfer, like so. And we're going to plug this in here, and you can see immediately I've got this red, and that's the attribute. The grid is actually been transferred, but quite aggressively to this whole setup. So just to reduce that a bit, what we want to do is bring down the radius. But first of all, what I want to actually do is come to this first input of the attribute transfer. And this is just a precaution, but what I like to do is turn off my primitives. And then on the points, I want to target my specific attribute. And this is fine, not to do this on this setup. It's quite simple. But if you've got quite a lot of geometry and a lot of attributes on it, you don't want to accidentally transfer the wrong attribute on and override something that you necessarily, you've created on the side, and you might accidentally overwrite it by transferring a dead attribute onto. And yeah, so just a precaution is just to, keep the attributes that you want to transfer on specifically. And then we're going to go to the conditions, and now we can just reduce this radius, and you can see if we ghost our little grid here, we've got quite a wide radius, so that's like 2 meters. So I want to come right down here. We can maybe blur it a bit, and you can see it's starting to create a bit of a softer edge for us. So that's kind of working quite well. Obviously, it's a single frame. So now we need to look at doing the attribute transfer in the solver. And this will allow us to kind of start transitioning better. Now we're obviously going to create a transition from the next foot as well, and then the arms. But let's get the transfer set up working roughly first. So I'm going to create the solver. And what I want to do, just go ahead, is I want to Control X this to cut it. And I want to plug my scatter points into the first input of my solver, and then my grid into the second input here. So let's just view this, and I'm going to go inside here, and you can see now we've got these inputs here. So the first input is obviously our scattered points, and that's that 61,000 points we've generated. The second input, you can see if I can view it here, it's the grid. And let's just Control V to paste our attribute transfer again. So I want to attribute transfer onto the previous frame of the data. I want to transfer the grid information. And let's just go out here. The next thing what I want to do is we've got this initiation frame, which is the 174. So our solver can actually start at that frame as well. So we're going to go 174. You don't want to pre-solve any data. That's just going to make the transition not work properly. And we can go here, and then you can see we've got some stuff happening. And my viewport's messing out again. Let's just reset this again. Not too sure why I'm having this issue here today. And you can see it doing something, but it's not really growing. So we can actually look at the attribute over here in isolation as well. So activate. And let's have a look and see. We've got some going up values, and there's some in between values here that are changing as they go towards 1, and it should end up on 1. Let's just look there. There's quite a bunch of 1s there. So those are those points there. Now what we want to do is increase the value of this attribute so it kind of accumulates on each frame. And to do that, we can simply add to this attribute. Before I go in here, what I want to do is just pin this viewport. And that's just so we're always looking at the solver level. So when we dive in here, and something changes, we can quickly reset it and view it again without diving in and out all the time. So what I want to do is just to add to it is I want to do a attribute wrangle. And I want to take this activate. I can just copy this because I'm lazy. And I can do, let's go, it's a float value. So f at activate. And then I want to increase it by a value. So I can multiply equals by, say, 1.5. And that's just going to allow me to, increase the attribute value over every frame. And you can see it there, it's kind of increased to 1.5. Still not really growing as such, but what we can do after this is we can actually blur the attribute as well. So on each frame, it's going to blur, and then it's going to increase the value of that attribute that's blurred, and that should start basically allowing us to bleed upwards. And to do that, we can simply use a attribute blur. Plug this in here. We want to target our activate. Just remove this P here. And let's just reset this, and you can see, well, nothing's really happening as such. And that's because we're dealing with points, and this points, there's no connectivity between them. So you can see on the attribute blur here, there's a influence type by connectivity. So I'm just going to turn that off, pin border points, and then just do by proximity. And this will allow us to blur an attribute basically on scattered points. So now if I scrub through here, we should start seeing some information. I think I'm getting some display issues again. Let's just double check this. Okay, I'm just going to come up here. Let's just reset this. Sometimes the caching breaks. And let's scrub through here, and you can see, well, now we're getting, as it's accumulating, you can see that this value is going quite extreme though. It's like pushing up. We've got a couple of hundred already, and it's moving fairly slowly up through this setting. So we can try and, reduce the intensity or limit it, so that we're going to use a clamp so it doesn't go up to, above 1. And we want to make a transition a little bit quicker as well. So let's do that next. Okay, so let's just tidy this up a little bit. And what I want to do is maybe we should just put this all in a little net box, and we can, just basically keep it separate so we know this is the transition area. I'm going to bring up my color display and make this a little slightly darker, like a slightly more darker gray. And coming back down to here to our transition. So the first thing we need to set up is to actually have access to each of these primitives and to create a centroid for each one. Luckily, we've got a node called extract centroid, and we can plug this in and have a look and see what it does. So immediately we can see we've got a bunch of points, and it's kind of not really doing what we want to do, and that's because the lab subdivision is kind of joined. So we want to have access to each primitive, and in order to do that, we need to split these primitives up so they individual. Each one's an individual primitive. It's currently seen as one kind of piece at the moment. So we can do a primitive split, and we can just plug this in over here. And what I want to do is just deactivate this name attribute here. All right, and let's just view our extract, and you can see, well, it's still not working, but what we actually do need out of this, you can see it's asking for this name attribute again. And what I want to do is create basically a attribute on each one of these, and a name attribute, but we don't want to call it name, but we're going to call it something else. So what I can do is just use a connectivity SOP. Oh, sorry. Connectivity SOP over here. And this will basically, by default, create an attribute called class. And we can keep it as points, but I'm going to change this from class. Let's call this panels. It's a little bit clearer. So it's each individual panel we're getting the connectivity on. We've got there, we can see we've got all these panels here. So there's 2000 or 25 or 258,211. So that lines up to that. And now if I look at my centroid, I go back here and I set my piece attribute to that panels. Sorry, I need to change the element type to points and change this now to panels. It will see that. Now you can see we've got all these points. There's tons of them. And if I had to, for instance, ghost the previous frame here, or previous node, you can see I've got a centroid point on each actual panel, which is sort of handy, but not too handy in our case because we don't really want that point. We just want the information of that's the centroid. So, we don't want a point there. We just want that data. So we can, on the actual extract centroid, we can actually output our attribute, and that will, you can see those points immediately disappear. But if you look in your spreadsheet, you can see we've got now a centroid attribute that's popped up. And this is basically taking, for what you want to say, the bounding box of each object and putting a centroid attribute on each one. So it's basically pointing where that point would have been instead, and that's a lot more useful than generating extra data. Okay, so how do we use that now? So I want to create a attribute VOP, and what we're going to do is do a transform on that. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to do attribute VOP, and we can just plug this in here, and let's just call this scale. We can do all sorts of things, like we can scale and rotate maybe prims, and so you can do all sorts of things with this. So what we want to actually do is use a node called the make transform or transform matrix. So we can do transform, type transform here, and let's use this one here. So it's transform matrix. Now you can see it's got some inputs. If I just plug my position in here and I plug this position in here, you can see, well, nothing changes except my display is bugging out again. Really don't know why this is doing this to me today. Let's look at that. So anyway, if I scale this down, you can see it's kind of scaling, and because this guy is not sitting at the origin, it's basically going to scale. As I scale down, it's going to scale down to the origin. If I set this to 0, it will be 1 point or a bunch of points sitting at the origin, and that's because we've got no pivot, and the pivot would be this. So if I to adjust the pivot and then scale down, it's going to scale down around that pivot. So to create the pivot or bring in the pivot that we want, we can use the centroid that we created. So to do that, what I'm going to do is create a bind, and I want to call this centroid that we created. Right, and that centroid is a vector, and I'm going to plug this centroid into this pivot over here. So now if I scale down, you can see immediately, very easily, I'm actually scaling each individual face, and that's really cool. So we can actually just mess around with them like that, just because I now have that centroid of each component. Very cool. And then what we can do now is obviously, we want to scale them down over time based off this transition, and we want to also move them a little bit away from the surface as they're transitioning. So we're going to get this basic going. I want to add a couple of extra things to it, afterwards, make it a bit more interesting. But let's get the basic setup going. So what we can do as well, so we want to do another bind. Let's type bind correctly this time. And we want to get that active weight attribute of ours. And what we want to do is create a scale that we can scale by this attribute. So I'm going to just make it a little bit more controllable. I'm going to do a fit range. I'm going to plug this in here, and then I want to plug this into my scale. Now I can, split this out into individual pieces if I wanted to, and I can, maybe add some noise into it or something like that. But I don't need to really do that offhand. So you can see at the moment, it's not really working too well. But that's our values are probably incorrect. So let's just play around with the values and see what we can get. So we've got a little value there. Let's see if it's changing as we transition through. not really doing anything. So maybe our setup isn't quite correct here. I think potentially what I've done here is I might have removed my activate. Oh yeah, sorry, because we promoted it here to create a slightly more interesting look on that mask. It's now obviously a primitive attribute, and it's now obviously not being seen at the point level. So there's two ways. We can actually import it into props using a primitive attribute, or we can do a promote back to points if we want to. But for now, let's just dive in here. And instead of doing this, I want to do a import primitive attribute. I want to use this exact same name. So let's just copy and paste this here. And then I want to import it from the first input, which can just be this. And this needs to be a float. And let's just plug this in over here and see what kind of results we get. So yeah, there we can see now that's working. So as I scale through with that transition now, it's going from, you know, a 0 or not 0 value. If I push this down to 0, it's basically looking like it's deleted, but it's still there. If I view my points, they all just collapsed onto the center. And you can play through this, and it actually works quite well. It's kind of got this interesting look. And then with the fit range, we could always, like I did in the original, just to give it a bit more interest, is just limit the outward end a bit so that it doesn't fully, you know, close. So we've got little gaps between the setup like this. Just creates a bit more interest when we get to rendering stage. And then obviously this is quite linear. We could add some noise into it to break it up a bit more. But for now, that's fine. I'm going to leave it like that. What I want to do next is just scale these or push them outwards a little bit as the kind of transition is developing. And to do that, I'm going to push the primitives out based off the normals of the object. So to do that, I need to just go up and double check that I've got normals in here. And I'm going to come up here and turn this on. You can see, well, don't really have normals. There's nothing on here. There might be some, no, there's no vertex normal either. So we're going to drop a normal sub. And then we just can plug this in down here. And then importantly, we want to use point normals. I'm going to turn this on. And you can see now we get these active normals on the points. All right, so diving back in here, I can grab these normals that are over here, and I can basically add them to this transition here by a value. So I'm going to take this normal and I'm going to multiply it by value and just plug this into the transition. You can see immediately, let's turn this display off, these things are scaling outwards madly. And if I come over here and I just say middle mouse on here and I say promote parameter, and that's going to give me a parameter that's sitting at this level, and I can now scale the pieces in and out. But obviously I don't want to scale them out over here. I just want to scale them, you know, just before they transition. So just going back in here, I need to multiply in my active transition in there as well. So give myself some more space. And I want to, you know, maybe change it up a little bit. So I'm going to duplicate this fit range here and I'm going to plug it into my multiplier as well. And you can see now I've got the transition happening out and inwards here. And that's controlled overall by this. So if I just push this to 1, for instance, We could potentially control it over here just with this fit range as well, instead of doing this other multiplier. But if I set this to 1 and this one to 0, you can see now I've got this kind of transition that's, these pieces are coming from kind of out of nowhere, from the sides a little bit. Just creates a little bit more of a dynamic look, and adds to that digital glitch kind of feel. And we can obviously control this. We can fit range this a little bit so it's a bit more aggressive, or do it like that. So it's really kind of sharpens up that transition a little bit, something like that. And then we can control the overall value like this, or we can do it with our value up here. We might not want to be so aggressive on it, so something like that. And yeah, so that's the kind of basis of the transition. Like say you can actually come in here and you can actually start doing some rotations as well, which is quite handy if you really want to create that next level. And just to show you, we can quite easily do that with the activator as well. So maybe just duplicating this, remembering this is a vector, so we can split this out, or just rotate around one vector. So I can do maybe a float to vector, and this would be my X, Y, and Z rotation. So if I just plug this into the 1 and plug this in here, we can potentially rotate, just remembering this is a 0 to 1, we need to rotate at higher values. So you can rotate this around potentially one vector, or a different one if you want. And that might just, that creates a slightly different look as well, which is quite nice. And just scrolling through that gives you another level of interest. So I'm going to leave this in here. I'm just going to reduce it down to a lower value, maybe 45 or so, somewhere around there, just so we get a slightly more broken up edge, something like that. And that's the basis of our transition. And now we can start looking at maybe adding a little bit of variation in, maybe some noise just to break it up a little bit more. And then we can move on to generating the outlines and seeing if it works, copying this back to the actual animation afterwards. Okay, before we move on to generating the outline stuff, just want to create a little bit more variation in this edge here. And to do that, I'm simply just going to go back to my solver here. And inside the solver, what I actually want to do is add a noise. And I'm going to use a attribute adjust float. Just typing ADF here, and it comes up over here. And let's just plug this in up here, just between the attribute transfer and the wrangle here. That should be fine. Right, and so we want to use the activate attribute. That's a point attribute. And what I want to do is I want to create some noise on it. Now, obviously, as soon as I just do an add noise, it's not really doing anything ideal. So what I want to do is actually use a multiplier. And you can see as I'm scrolling through here, I've got this noise kind of happening. It's not smooth anymore. And it's kind of filling up over time now. It's obviously not very fast. So we need to speed that up and maybe just sharpen up the noise a little bit. So I come in a few frames forward like this. And then just on this ramp, let's just sharpen up the detail a little bit so we don't have so much of a fall off. And that's probably about it. We can play with the element size a little bit, maybe something like that. And let's just go up to the top layer of this up here. Just reset it to be sure. And let's have a look and see. So now generating this. with a little bit more variation in. It's got some kind of a broken up edge, which is a bit better. And maybe it's moving a little bit slow, so we can potentially just come in and, tweak the ramp a little bit, maybe make it a bit sharper, make this a bit smaller, reset this. And yeah, it's working quite well. Got this edge that's kind of slowly disappearing, but yeah, that should be fine for what we want. And now we can simply just go back down to the bottom of the stream where we set this up, and everything should still be working just fine. So got a nice little slightly more organic edge going on now. It's looking quite cool. The one thing what I wanted to do just from an efficiency point of view is just looking at the points here. We've got all these edges that we've basically scaled down to nothing, and they obviously still all there. So what we can simply do is blast them out, and I'm going to use a blast node. And what I want to do is use the transition that we've created to basically delete the geometry. Instead of creating a group, I'm going to create an ad hoc group, and that's actually just using the attribute, this attribute activate that we created in this group. So to do that, it's quite easy. I can use activate. Just make sure I spell it correctly. And then we can do a greater than or less than, and make it remembering our activate attribute is between 0 and 1. I can do like a 0.1 maybe, for instance. And you can see immediately now I'm deleting out all that geometry based off my little attribute. And that's just going to give us a way more efficient look. We can maybe dial this in and out a bit. So if it's higher up, we're going to get less of our transition, but we want some of the, or quite a bit of the transition there, because we're scaling it out and creating some interest on the edge here. So I think we're going to leave it quite low like that, and then at least we're deleting all the unnecessary stuff we don't want. And just to double check that this still works, we're going to go to our transform pieces, and let's just spacebar G on the keyboard over the viewport to zoom in on it. And having a look through the camera, you can see everything's working as expected still. So that's pretty handy. Now the next thing, we can just go back to this, and let's have a look and see how we can create this outline and how we can start separating out the geometry for the rendering. So we want to create an outline, a solid kind of refracted area, and then we need the original body with the textured robot. That's basically going to be an inverted mask of this, and that's, so we're going to have 3 essentially layers for the rendering. And yeah, let's have a look at doing that next. Okay, so what I'm going to do is come back here, and what I want to do is just create a null so we can separate out our geometry a little bit clearer here. So I want to call this outlines, and I want to create another one, and I want to call this panels, which is essentially going to be these panels here that we're going to render. And then we're going to need a third one, and this is going to be the body. Let's call this main body. And this is actually not going to be panels. We actually need the original geometry in here. So I'm going to go back to my static mesh all the way up here. I don't want the any of these panels because it's going to mess up the texturing. So we need the actual original mesh. And just plug that in there like so. Now the only thing is we've got this activate transition that's obviously happening on this reworked bunch of geometry here. So I want it on this, the activate on this body as well. So I can simply just duplicate the attribute transfer and then plug my body into that. And now I've got it, that attribute transfer on the body. It's not 100% great. Obviously the mesh is a bit wonky. So what we can do to clean that up a little bit is we can actually potentially remesh this geometry just so that we get a little bit more data out of the transfer. And that it might not necessarily be necessary to remesh it, just if you want a bit more accuracy. But for now, we're gonna, leave it like this. And if we want more accuracy on this transition with our masks and stuff, we can definitely remesh it. So just to get the system working, we're gonna leave it like this for the moment. And so I've got my 3 components now. So what I need to obviously do is do the outlines, and let's go ahead and do that. So I am going to start off with a convert line node. Let's plug this in here and do that, and you can immediately see, well, we've got basically outlines. We've deleted all the polygons and we're just left with the lines. Now there's one small issue with this, and that is because looking at our spreadsheet, we've changed the geometry up a little bit again. The convert line does a bunch of operations inside the node, and it actually effectively is destroying our name attribute. You can see we've got gaps here again. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to do what we did up here with the loop, and looping over each piece and recopying that name attribute on again. So just to make sure that it's working properly. So we're going to do another for each named primitive. And let's plug this in here. And we're going to put our convert line in there. You can see we're targeting a piece of geometry here. Let's just view one. Maybe we can just select one component here just to see that it's working. There we go. Basically converting one object at a time to lines. And then we can do our copy, attribute copy. I'm just going to copy and paste this, plug this into the relative inputs. And this one will go into the second input. So it's giving me that little warning again. But don't worry about that. It is definitely working. So let's just turn off single pass and plug this to my outlines. So now I've got my outlines working. And let's have a look and see, just to make sure that this is actually generating the proper data. We're going to plug this in here. And I've disconnected my transform pieces. So this goes into this one. And let's check. So now we've got the outline working. And obviously, if I had to have just done it directly through here, we would get some serious errors, and quite interesting looking vibe though. But yeah, definitely not what we don't want. So I'm just gonna undo this, and yeah, have a look at what we got here. So the next thing what we want to do is create a color attribute on this, and we can use that in the shader when we're rendering. And then we need a width attribute to control the width at render time of this. Basically, these are, being rendered as curves now in Karma. So we need a width attribute on those. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm just going to view this guy without the transform. So we can see this. We've got our activate visualizer on. So let's turn that off. And because we want to start dealing with color and stuff, so I'm going to drop a color node, plug this in here, and then what I want to do is I want to, give it a nice bright color, but I want to give it a slight gradient, and we're going to do the gradient based off that activate attribute. So if I go here to my color type, and I change the type, the constant, to ramp from attribute, and now we can add a attribute here. But now you'll see as I do that, I don't have my activate attribute, and that's obviously because upstream here we've changed the attribute type to a primitive attribute, and that was just to give us a slightly different transition. So what I want to do is actually convert it back to a point for the outlines. So I'm going to just duplicate it and bring it down here, and I want to set my activate from primitive to point now. So it's basically reversing what we did up here. And I can come back to my color again. I've gone through the loop, so the convert line will keep that attribute luckily at a point level for us, and we can now see it in here. So now we can do a nice transition based off that gradient. And so let's go ahead and create a little bit of color. So we want this kind of a nice bluish color, kind of give it a bit of life. Can mess around with it a little bit afterwards, but what I want to do is potentially have more than one color. So, and then this edge that's kind of breaking away, I wanted to, if you remember in the trailer, it was quite bright. So we're going to, this is almost like a spark kind of blown out area that's transitioning. So we want to make this a very bright color. I've got to make it a blue as well, but what I want to do is up the intensity here. So we get this kind of blown out white area, and this will kind of intensify at shader level when we're rendering if the value is above 1. So that's pretty cool. And then we can potentially even go slightly darker towards the edge. So we've got a little bit of a 3-layer kind of setup going on with color wise. And you can always remap this a little bit. You can't really go too far up because it's 0 to 1, but this will kind of squeeze the attribute in a bit if you wanted to do that as well. So, but I think that's working quite well. Now the next thing what we want to do is create the width attribute. And to do this, I'm just going to create a wrangle, attribute wrangle, just drop this in over here. And the width attribute is just actually called at width. And then what I want to do is I want to control it by this activate attribute as well. So I'm just going to, for now, I'm just going to give it a single value just so we can gauge how this actual width is working. I'm going to go 0.1. And yeah, so viewing that, you can see nothing it's happening. Well, it's kind of is doing a visual for us. And if you don't see anything happening in the viewport with this, what you can do is if you come up to the object level of your geometry, and under the miscellaneous tab over here, there's this shade open curves in the viewport, and sometimes that needs to be on, or actually should be on most of the time if you're rendering curves. So, and that will allow you to show the width attribute. So obviously this is quite wide, we want to maybe drop it down to something lower. And we could, kind of run with this if we wanted to, but I just want to use that activate attribute just to make sure that we actually are scaling down these edges as we go along. So I want to use the activate. And you can see, well, now it's obviously that activate is a 0 to 1 value. So that's not ideal. So to get that to work nicely. You can see it's scaling down quite nicely at the edges here. But we want to scale it down overall, and to do that I'm going to use a fit range or fit 01 range. So I'm going to do fit 01, open bracket, and then close bracket. And then just in here, we're going to give it a value. So it requires a minimum value and a maximum value. So the first one would be your maximum value. And then your second one, yeah, or the other way around. Yeah, no, it's the other way around, sorry. So this would be your minimum value, which is 0. And then your maximum value, 0.1 of your width. So we want 0.01. Let's make it a little bit bigger just to see, something like that. And you can see we're getting this nice scale down on the wires actually as it's actually disappearing. So that's pretty cool. It's working quite well. Now, obviously, the only thing we need to look at and consider is when we're rendering this is, looking at this wireframe, we can see right through to the back. So we actually want to silhouette this outline. And to do that, we're just going to actually take the body of the robot and we're going to matte it out in the render with that. So we need, essentially duplicates, and that's why we created these extra components here that we're going to utilize in the rendering. So we'll look at doing that setup next. Okay, so let's have a look at bringing in, and just for now merging in the outlines and the panels. And we can see what that's kind of looking like. So we've got these nice outlines and everything seems to be working fine. What I'd like to do is just do a slight offset on the outlines. And to do this, I'm going to use a peak sop. And this is just to subtly expand the outlines a little bit more. And this is just going to help us, when it's rendering, to visualize the render a little bit. 0.01, quite small. And you can see it pushes it out. Might be a little bit much even. And that's, yeah, just disable it. So you can see it's just going to give us, bulk up the line a little bit and make it a little bit more visible in the renderer. And obviously you can see now if we've got this kind of visual, we've still got very close up holes, but that's fine. To the most part it's covered. So, and then this panel is going to be rendered as like a refraction layer. And then the outlines we can render separate as well, or we can combine it, depends on your render capacity and how you want to render. I've got some weird viewport error here. Let's just home in on it again. It's kind of sometimes bugging out, and it might be because I'm recording the OpenGL and the GPUs, giving me a little bit of issue. All right, so that's working fairly well. So now we need to just prep this really for rendering. And what I want to do is, this is kind of a bunch of geometry, and then this panels is a bunch of geometry, and we want a reasonable and easy setup that we can utilize in Solaris for Canvas render. So to do that, what I want to do is actually do a pack on the geometry, and we might have to do this, after our transform. So let's have a look and see if we pack this. So I'm going to view this again, and now if I have this pack, you can see it obviously breaks, so that's not ideal. So what I want to do is actually pack the geometry afterwards. But now you can see I've got now only one component here, and I want, all three. I want the panels and the body. So I'm actually going to keep this split out. So I'm going to do a transform pieces on each of these and then do a pack. So instead of doing a merge up here, we're going to do this. So I've got the panels, and then I've got the outlines. And then if I duplicate this again, I've got my main body geometry as well that's coming through like that. And then we need to give this reasonable names, just for clarity when we're in the USD context, Solaris context. I'm going to drop a name sub, and let's call this geo outlines, and that should be good. I'm going to duplicate this, and let's call this geo panels, and this one's going to be our main body, geo main body. All right, and then what I can do is, if I want to just import them all into Solaris in one thing, I can just merge it over here like so, and just create a null here and say, let's say to render. Now we can obviously write this if you want to transport it around to another scene, or you want it to be a bit more efficient. We can do a export USD over here. Oh, sorry. And we can write this directly to disk, and then just load it in Solaris at a disk level. But since I'm setting it up in this one scene, I'm just going to keep it live. You know, it's not entirely too slow, and we're not really looking for real-time playback, so not too worried about that at the moment. So let's just actually go into Solaris and double check that, you know, the setup we've created here, our 3 packed primitives with our setup, is actually coming in properly. So I'm going to select this node and I'm going to control copy it. Quite a handy just shortcut to do. Go to object level. Now, instead of switching context to stage, what I want to do is stay at object level, and I want to do a locknet over here. And this is basically giving me a stage that I can access over here. Let's call this lighting. And I can dive in here, and then, you know, if I wanted to copy this scene into another scene, a new scene, or just this, I've got then everything that I've done in my lighting. I can just copy it from one node. It's a little bit more tricky when you're jumping between contexts like this. All right, so diving in here, I'm going to do a SOP import, and I'm going to go over here and Control V to paste that path that we copied. And you can see immediately, so I've got my calmest XPU rendering already, and you can see we've got our bot coming through with these layers, and they're all on top of each other, so it's not really giving us much, but you can see the outlines are working quite nicely, even though they aren't shaded. And if you look at our SOP import over here in the geometry spreadsheet, or the Solaris viewer, you can see here I've got my SOP import, and then I've got the body outlines, and these are basically all the components we want to shade and treat them differently. So just going back to my viewport here, what I want to do, and we can just do this in the next video, we can start doing it while we're in this context. We may as well, you know, create some base shaders and just look at how we can import that, you know, these colors to work properly with the shaders and that active attribute. So let's have a look at that in the next video. Hey, and welcome to week 1's assignment. For this week, what I'd like to do is just looking at the setup, what we've done so far. We've got this lot subdivision mesh here, which is looking quite cool. But perhaps we can try to do something slightly different, create a different pattern, and whether that's subdividing it and smoothing it, or we're doing something a little bit more interesting. You could look at using the divide node, or possibly the remesh node. Just play around with some ideas, and the challenge here is to, you know, create a slightly different look to what we have here, and then to make sure that it connects up and does still transforms to the animation. So yeah, so looking forward to seeing some various results, and good luck.